I want to introduce our second speaker, Samuel Hoadley-Brill from CUNY Graduate Center. He will be presenting for us this morning, Conceptualizing Antiracism in Public Philosophy. So please take it away.
I have a pretty quick presentation. I'm not presenting too many original thoughts, but this is conceptualizing racism and anti-racism in public philosophy. So the past summer, as we know, the protests following the police killing of George Floyd prompted a huge surge in sales of nonfiction books about race and about racism, two of which spent the entire summer on the New York Times Bestsellers List: Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility from 2018 and Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Antiracist from 2019. So following that, basically, DiAngelo and Kendi have come to be seen as the leading anti-racist public intellectuals in the United States. They have had interviews on late night talk shows, as well as major news networks like CBS and MSNBC. And DiAngelo and Kendi might not describe themselves as such, but I think it's fair to say that they have become the most popular, the most prominent public philosophers of race in the United States. And so for those of us committed to trying to eliminate racial injustice in this country and ideally everywhere, this looks like a great step. People are buying these books. Presumably they're reading them. We can't tell the extent to which people are actually reading them, but it looks like a good step forward. But we have to ask, are the ideas that are being put forward in these books good ideas? Are they going to be productive for actually eliminating or reducing the amount of racism that we see in our society? So that's the main question. So the goals of the presentation. So I'm going to critique the approaches to racism and anti-racism in White Fragility and in How to Be an Anti-Racist. A lot of my criticisms have been made before by many other people. And then I'm going to point to an alternative model based on the work of Tommy Shelby and audience member Charles Mills, my professor himself, actually. So let's get started. A lot of discussion about racism, especially, when white people feel that they are being accused of something that they don't think is racist, or that when people invoke the ideas of systemic or institutional racism, people will refer back to this common dictionary definition. So the Oxford Dictionary defines racism as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So this is a very individualistic understanding of racism. On this model, racism is not necessarily systemic or institutional. So Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility, we'll start with her book. This actually is still on the New York Times bestsellers list. Last time I checked, it's been there for over 2 years now. DiAngelo defines racism as a society-wide dynamic that occurs at the group level. She says, when I say that only whites can be racist, I mean that in the United States, only whites have the collective social and institutional power and privilege over people of color. People of color do not have this power and privilege over white people. I apologize for lack of page numbers. I only have an ebook, which doesn't have the correct page numbers. Here, although she doesn't elaborate on it here, right, she says only white people can be racist. Members of different ethnic minority groups cannot be racist toward one another, and nor can anyone be racist against white people. Ibram Kendi actually denies this. Ibram Kendi says that there is anti-white racism, though I'm not going to get much into that in this presentation. We might typically think that it's bad to be racist, that racism is a bad thing. DiAngelo doesn't really, it's kind of unclear whether it's a good or bad thing. It seems like she thinks it's necessarily a bad thing, but here we see being good or bad is not relevant. Racism is a multi-layered system embedded in our culture. All of us are socialized into the system of racism. Racism cannot be avoided. Whites have blind spots on racism, and I have blind spots on racism. Racism is complex, and I don't have to understand every nuance of the feedback to validate that feedback. And here we see at the end, bias is implicit and unconscious. So appeals to the idea of implicit bias, which was popularized with the implicit association test, the IAT. So a lot of recent work in psychology has been done on the idea of implicit bias, and though I'm not going to get much into it in this presentation, there's been a lot of research come out to show that actually we're not really sure what implicit bias is or whether it predicts people's behavior. This is an intuitive way of understanding, the persistence of racial discrimination, even in the absence of explicitly racially discriminatory policy on the institutional level. But it's not clear that this can actually do the job here. Another thing here, racism cannot be avoided. So we might ask, well, what is the point then? Is any progress going to be made using the idea of white fragility or using these racial diversity trainings that Robin DiAngelo gets paid millions of dollars per year to conduct? In 2015, she actually said at the National Race and Pedagogy Conference that the question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest in that situation? So it's never worth asking whether racism actually took place. We can assume that it's always operating in every corner of society at every level. It's just a matter of how it took place. So the notion of white fragility is what she develops, what she's been developing actually since her first paper on the subject in 2011, but she developed her work since then into this book. A lot of the book discusses her experiences conducting these racial diversity trainings, where she describes the reactions of white people in the audience to certain things that she said as instances of white fragility. So white fragility for her is what happens when we try to talk openly and honestly about race. White fragility quickly emerges as we are so often met with silence, defensiveness, argumentation, certitude, and other forms of pushback. These are not natural responses. They are social forces that prevent us from attaining the racial knowledge we need to engage more productively, and they function powerfully to hold the racial hierarchy in place. So when DiAngelo talks about white fragility in terms of the different reactions to certain provocations that constitute white fragility, she always comes back to these examples, but she doesn't elaborate so much upon these points. The problem with that is that if we take this list of reactions, silence, defensiveness, argumentation, certitude, and other forms of pushback, it sounds like what we get is if Robin DiAngelo tells you that you have done something which is a manifestation of your white fragility, and you try to say, actually, no, it's not white fragility. I disagree with this point. Well, then that itself also turns out to be a manifestation of your white fragility. So it turns into this thing that people often call a Kafka trap, where rejection of some claim turns out to be inevitably further evidence of that claim. The next slide here. So this is an interesting point. In an interview with New York Times writer Daniel Bergner, Robin DiAngelo says at some point that capitalism is so bound up with racism, but that she avoids critiquing capitalism because she doesn't need to give people reasons to dismiss her. She says, capitalism is dependent on inequality on an underclass. If the models profit over everything else, you're not going to look at your policies to see what is most racially equitable. There's something deeply ironic here because DiAngelo doesn't want to give people reasons to dismiss her, although she notes that already, all her ideas about white fragility are just giving white people more and more reasons to dismiss her. But she knows that capitalism is really at the root of this problem as far as she sees it. And yet she won't address capitalism. She's become quite wealthy herself on all of these racial diversity trainings. And her book suggests that at least one solution that white people can take is to sort of recognize their privilege and their fragility and to accept it and to just listen to people of color. She often says, listen to people of color, listen to Black people, listen to X people, without ever acknowledging that those people disagree about all sorts of things. There's a risk here of running too individualistic an approach and just allowing white fragility to function as a blanket to white people, make white people more comfortable without actually addressing the root problem at all. Relatedly, philosopher Olufemi Taiwo has a recent article called Being in the Room Privilege, Elite Capture and Epistemic Deference, which I thought one of the best articles I read last year, So he calls this idea just listen to X people, right? Listen to Black people, listen to women, whatever it is, as deference epistemology, in contrast to the completely reasonable, he thinks, standpoint epistemology. So deference practices that serve attention-focused campaigns, such as we've read Too Many White Men, Let's Now Read Some People of Color, can fail on their own highly questionable terms. Attention to spokespeople from marginalized groups could, for example, direct attention away from the need to change the social system that marginalizes them. Essentially, the bulk of my critique against Robin DiAngelo is that with this model, with this underdeveloped account of white fragility, which I think white fragility definitely is a thing when it comes to talking to white people about race, there is this fragility that can manifest. But if any form of pushback becomes white fragility, then it's unclear how we can productively move the conversation forward. And again, the individualistic model that seems to be suggested from her approach doesn't actually tackle the root of the problem. So moving on to Kendi. So Ibram Kendi has these seemingly radical redefinitions of racism, of racist and anti-racist as well. So for Kendi, a racist is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. Anti-racist, the opposite. That in itself sounds totally fine. But then the question is, what is a racist idea? What is a racist policy? A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. And an anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. By policy, I mean written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations that govern people. There is no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. So equity, as he describes later, is basically equal outcomes in terms of representation in regards to proportion in the overall population. So as every policy can be described as either racist or anti-racist. So if there's a certain speed limit, say it's 65 miles per hour, and we say, should we raise the speed limit to 70 miles per hour? One thing we should ask is whether that will lead to more racially equitable or less racially equitable outcomes. How we know that will happen, I'm not sure, but every policy, right, needs to be checked according to this guideline. We have in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, the claim, when you truly believe that racial groups are equal, then you also believe that racial disparities must be the result of racial discrimination. This sort of flies in the face of all social science, but this seems to be the claim, is that any disparity must be the result of discrimination. And then here, I just want to include, before we get into the potential counterexamples, his claims about ethnic racism. Basically, same thing, but racialized ethnic groups more generally, and not just racial groups. We might think, my intuition is to say race is these larger categories like white, black, that are obviously socially constructed. Ethnic groups, much more specific, that there are like clusters of ethnic groups that make up races, right? So, for instance, like ethnic group might be Ashkenazi Jew or Italian or Zulu or something like that. But there, these are fuzzy lines. People draw them in different places. So ethnic racism, though, is seeing any inequity between racialized ethnic groups. So say there was an disparity, as we'll see an example, between French Americans and Russian Americans. Well, then that would have to also be the result of a racist policy. So some troubling cases, according to 2014 U.S. Census estimates, Jewish Americans made up less than 2% of the U.S. population. According to Hillel in 2015, Yale was 27% Jewish undergrad. Harvard was 25% Jewish undergrad. If it must be the case that this is an example of racial inequity, then this must be due to a racist policy. This starts to sound kind of like an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, that there is some policy in place that is producing a bunch of Jewish undergraduates at Ivy League institutions. We know that there's a sort of dark history of Ivy League institutions actually implementing caps at how many Jewish students can enroll. So this is one counterexample here. Another comes from Coleman Hughes' critique of the book in City Journal. Ibram Kendi has been asked in a presentation about critiques from Coleman Hughes, and he claimed that Coleman Hughes constantly misrepresents his work, although I couldn't find any examples of that. So Coleman Hughes' point is that according to 2017 Census Bureau data, the average Haitian American earned 68 cents for every dollar earned by the average Nigerian American. The average French American earned 70 cents for every dollar earned by the average Russian American. These must be apparently the result of racist policies. It seems like it doesn't make sense to say that there is some policy discriminating against French Americans, but not Russian Americans, or Nigerian Americans, but not Haitian Americans. Finally, summing up thoughts about Kendi, I think the main problem with Kendi's framework, there are two main problems. One is that it sort of just assumes a consequentialist outlook without any argument for that. There are lots of people who don't agree that consequentialism is a correct general approach in ethics. And then the second would be that attributing every disparity to discrimination just is bad social science. There are plenty of potential counterexamples as we've seen. So finally, my recommendation to an alternative, this quote here from Tommy Shelby makes the point against Kendi quite clearly. This is from a paper from 2014. Shelby writes, "We should first note that just because the members from one racially defined group dominate and exploit members from another does not necessarily make the domination or exploitation morally worse than it would have been had it occurred intraracially. Members from one racial group can treat the members of another in abominable ways while being indifferent to the race of their victims. And in such cases, it's not meaningful to speak of racism at all. For Kendi, by contrast, that is racism by definition." The approach that Shelby outlines is racism as ideology. And so he defines that as primary, racism as a sort of ideology primarily. And then you have definitions of racist action and institutions. So racist action is one undertaken because of the agent's racist beliefs, or one the agent rationalizes in terms of those beliefs. An institution is racist if either its goals or policies are premised on or convey racist propositions, or its rules and regulations fail to be impartially and consistently applied because racial ideology has a pervasive, though perhaps unconscious, hold over its officials or functionaries. And finally, something similar comes in the first chapter of Charles Mills's Black Rights, White Wrongs, which is an interview where Mills writes, "Racism has been given various competing definitions and attributed competing areas of application. He would distinguish between racism in the ideational sense, ideas, beliefs, values, and racism in the socio-institutional sense. So for the first sense, in the individual sense, racism is the belief that humanity can be divided into discrete races, and these races are hierarchically arranged with some superior to others. In the socio-institutional sense, it refers to institutions, practices, and social systems that illicitly privilege some races at the expense of others, where racial membership directly or indirectly explains this privileging." So that's the gist of my presentation. As I said, not too many original ideas, just sort of pointing to some work that others have done as a better alternative to these very popular two authors who have come on the scene. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. We now have about 10 minutes for questions for Sam. So why don't you go ahead if you have a question and unmute yourself and ask away.
Sam, thank you so much for the presentation. I just want to know what you think. What do you think this the existence of arguments like these in these kind of widely disseminated, very popular form? What does that mean? This is a huge question, so like no pressure. But what do you think that means for social change? And as philosophers, potentially people doing public philosophy, what have you picked up on through reading these books that either is kind of a warning sign that we should look out for when it comes to presenting these kind of public arguments? Are there tactics that you think could help? Yeah, it's mainly a question of like communication and effectiveness, things like this.
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing, so the reason that I find at least, so DiAngelo concerning in particular is because a lot of people, in response to her popularity and as well the popularity of Kendi as well, a lot of people are concerned by the sort of Kafka trap problem in DiAngelo, as I've talked about, because they're concerned that basically what is advocating is a kind of deference epistemology that says, you can't really ask any questions. You must always just defer to the beliefs of people of color. And so what people are concerned by this because it really makes the possibility of constructive disagreement, it seems, impossible. So that was the main thing I found concerning in DiAngelo, is that it doesn't make a conversation. There's no conversation. It's just sort of a lecture rather than a conversation. And I mean, there is a lot of conservative backlash to these books in particular, that I came to be acquainted with through reading the book Cynical Theories, which is this very popular book written as a sort of polemic against all social justice types of scholarship and education. And that's become really popular, and that was concerning to me. So I wanted to make sure that people were okay with putting forward alternatives to this. And in terms of tactics, I get, the main thing is being open to criticism and disagreement, I think, is super important. It's the essence of philosophy, but it is concerning to me that DiAngelo's sort of model prevents that, and Kendi, in responding to Coleman Hughes, just has accused him of misrepresenting his work, although I can't find any examples of it. Yeah.
Professor Mills, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Sam, thanks so much for this presentation. Sorry, that sounds as if it's a bit self-praising there. Thanks so much for this presentation, independent whatever you had to say about Charles Mills. So you've been obviously following this stuff very assiduously, which is great. And I guess my question is sort of a follow-up to Jules. Do you think that those of us who think public philosophy is a worthwhile enterprise and are obviously very concerned about race, and with the Biden administration coming in, think of how appropriate a philosophical intervention could be now, insofar as they've committed themselves, at least nominally, to sort of pay attention to racial justice. So, do you think philosophers who are sort of weighing in publicly on these issues should now take it as part of their major task to start targeting DiAngelo and Kendi? In other words, are their views now sufficiently influential and perhaps sufficiently harmful that we should sort of make them part of the target also?
Interesting. So it depends on what you mean by target. So I think that that their views are sufficiently influential that they're worth engaging with, and thus I think critiquing, because I think for the reasons I gave that they're wrong about these things. I don't, but there is a potential for making them the main topic of discussion, and then sort of obfuscating the fact that, like, oh, actually, we need to address like all of the, we need to address poverty in low income communities. We need to address the legacy of redlining. We need to address all of these things, voter suppression. So I think they shouldn't be the main topics of discussion, which, maybe I'm contradicting myself here because I sort of made them the main pillars here. But, we're just our public philosophers gathering in private. When it comes to like the actual public outreach, I think it would be wise to always remain focused primarily on the root issues, and to then bring in as sort of as their ideas come up in the philosophical development, criticisms as are appropriate, I guess.
So we should keep the focus on racism and so forth, but on occasion, as you say, contingently perhaps, make a point of saying, while we appreciate the fact that DiAngelo and Kendi have gotten such prominence and sort of bringing the issue, very much into the public sphere, nonetheless, we want to register some disagreements with the way they frame things, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Which might come at the beginning of the discussion, right? Insofar as we define our terms early on in the debate. Yeah. Thanks. Good question.
Sounds good.
All right. I guess, should we do one more? Let's go ahead. Min Baek, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you for the presentation. Just have one question, something curious. When you mentioned DiAngelo's quote about how race is bound up with capitalism, do you think, I'm just not sure what DiAngelo's position is. Is that a statement about how racial capitalism is capitalism and capitalism is racial capitalism, or is that more of a, is that purely about, and what she seemed to be saying is that the profit motive is just gonna be indifferent to race, rather than suggesting a more constitutive role that race plays and has played in the history of capitalism? So I'm curious what DiAngelo's actual position is on this.
Yeah. So she definitely doesn't discuss it in the book. She might have other work that discusses it, but as far as, her focus on pedagogy, from what I can tell, racial capitalism is not a term I've ever heard her use. And I imagine that it's the latter of the options you suggested, that she was just sort of making a point about how capitalist incentives wouldn't give a CEO or someone any real reason to address the problem. So even within the context of the interview, it was a very strange sort of out of the blue remark that was made, which surprised me. But racial capitalism, in terms of, all the scholarship on that, I don't think I've seen her address.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.